Well, hello, everyone. It is great to be in this space with you again. My name is Suzette Chang, the founder and CEO of Thick Descriptions, and thank you for coming back and listening to our podcast, one of our disruptors, Elephant in the Room Unboxed. If you did not listen to the intro, we intentionally talk about different topics and themes and perspectives that are sometimes unique to Oklahoma. More often than not, they have a broader impact for the country and the world. And we intentionally get uncomfortable. So with that said, very happy to have one of my connected spirits is how I'd like to refer to is Kyle Lawson.
Hello.
So thank you for being here. And as we spoke about earlier before we started recording, definitely want to lean into the anthropological focus connections that you and I have. And so let's get into the history first, the archaeology of it all. And with that said, for those of you that don't know, anthropology is based in archaeology/history, language, biology when it's applicable, and in my argument is biology is always applicable because you can't separate the mind from the body. That's another conversation. And then the overarching theme or commitment is culture. So archaeology, history. How did you and I meet, Kyle?
We met pre-COVID
Yes.
when I was working for the Oklahoma Policy Institute
Yeah.
as their regional field organizer in
That's
southern
right.
Oklahoma. I was down in
Yeah.
Ardmore.
Yeah. That's right. I'm trying to remember. We didn't meet in Ardmore, did we?
No, we met here in Oklahoma City. It
Yeah.
was at the fundraiser, and you had a doctor there speaking. It was at an outside venue. I remember that. And we clicked right away.
Yeah,
'Cause
we
the
did.
first photos I have of us are in the photo booth there at that event, taking selfies and pictures together.
Yes. Yeah, okay. See, now I got to go back into my mental Rolodex. It's like, okay, where's that picture? Where's that? Okay, so in Oklahoma City. And I vividly remember a picture we took together with Together Oklahoma.
Yes.
We were at the Capitol, and it was you, myself, and a few other folks, all in our TOK T-shirts. You being the tallest human, so we were all kind of standing around you. And I want to say you took the photo arm high, so it was like, yeah, let's leverage this height and get a photo of all of us. I remember not being the only chocolate human there, but definitely not the only female. And I want to say it was like 7 or 8 of us, give or take.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. And you did work for Oklahoma Policy Institute, OPI. So lean in a little bit about your involvement as it relates to OPI.
So when I first started at the Policy Institute, they brought me on as a contracted employee to help with bringing policy education to rural Oklahoma around their policy topics. And it's kind of stemmed from that because the investors really loved the work that we were doing, that they said, we want to expand this program.
Okay.
And it just kept expanding to what it is today, which is now they have 4 full-time staff positions in the different quadrants of Oklahoma where they go out and work on policy education. And Angela Monson is now overseeing that program and doing a phenomenal job.
Yes.
Continuing the work there. And I think our biggest achievement was probably our work around expanding healthcare in Oklahoma. That was our biggest push at that time that you kind of stepped in and were helping us with as well.
Yeah. And Angela was a guest speaker a couple of months ago. So yeah, it was pretty cool of having those OPI connections. And listeners, if you're not familiar with OPI, also known as Oklahoma Policy Institute, it is, as Kyle said, a statewide organization very committed to educating educating Oklahomans about policy. So if you're not familiar with it, please check out their website. Lots of good data and information. In fact, I remember during the height of the teacher strike, many folks that were supporting that movement leaned heavily on the data and information that OPI provided at that time. It helped to really bring light to a community, meaning teachers that had been historically overlooked as it relates to pay. And that was like 16, 17?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
We're almost 10 years in, Kyle. Okay. So you spoke about health. So tell us a little bit more about your involvement as it relates to health in Oklahoma.
To get there, we got to go back a little bit further.
Okay.
When I first left the Army, immediately the barrier that I was running into was access to healthcare as a openly gay service member that left under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And so I immediately started working in Congress under Jim Colby, who was the 5th Congressional Representative for Arizona, around veteran healthcare access, specifically for the LGBTQIA2S+ community. And then it just kind of expanded from there. When Jim retired, I went in the private sector for a while, but then the town of Geontry kind of stirred some dust up, and I became the mayor for the town, and that's kind of what re-sparked the fire inside of me that got me back into politics. But very specifically, going way back early on, I was always really focused on access to healthcare for the LGBTQIA2S+ community, which was a huge attraction for me when the Oklahoma Policy Institute approached my region for a regional field organizer. And I said, well, I really want to get involved because healthcare is so important for rural Oklahoma, specifically for the LGBTQIA2S+ community.
And so for our listeners and watchers, and side note, are y'all checking out our hats? We did not plan this. I know I've been rocking this hat for a few days, about a month, give or take, because Oklahoma weather has been doing Oklahoma weather things. And if you don't know, it was like about a week ago. It was beautiful. I mean, I'm a native Californian, and I was thought, oh my gosh, I'm back in California. Not. And so my head's been cold. But yeah, I thought, why not be warm and fashionable? And so, and you've been rocking hats quite a bit here lately as well. So yeah. Okay. Now I will refocus, Suzette. Okay. So healthcare, talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So, and that kind of also goes back a little bit more into our history because you and I then kind of went on tour with Together Oklahoma, the Oklahoma Policy Institute, which for the listeners, the Oklahoma Policy Institute has an outreach boots on the ground organization called Together Oklahoma.
Yes.
And that's initially who I was contracted through, and I was employed by both organizations. And so then you and I went around Oklahoma and started doing listening sessions.
Correct.
Where we had conversations on the ground with individuals experiencing life in rural Oklahoma and identifying key factors that were affecting them.
Right. Right.
And we realized that we'll take Ardmore as like the best case study that we looked at, where there was this huge barrier for the, to abbreviate, queer community to healthcare. And when you say that, you think, oh, there's clinics everywhere. There's access to healthcare now with the expansion of healthcare in Oklahoma. Well, there's still a lot of barriers for the queer community. For example, one of the individuals we spoke with was a transhuman who, when they would have a cold, they would go to urgent care or their doctor. Okay. Let's say they did go to urgent care, not their doctor. They went to urgent care. Urgent care would say, oh, we don't do trans care. And the individual said, well, my cold's not trans.
Right.
I am. Treat my cold, not my gender.
Right.
And so we continued having conversations around these areas, and then access to a couple key words here, which is PEP and PrEP.
Okay.
PrEP is pre-exposure prophylaxis. So you would take it traditionally daily at the time. It was Descovy and Truvada were the two major medications. And since then, they've come out with injectables that are monthly. But you take a daily medication that if you are exposed to the HIV virus, it destroys the virus upon entry into the body. It creates a barrier.
Okay.
And then PEP is post-exposure prophylaxis.
Okay.
And that is typically for instances where individuals are sexually assaulted or a medical provider has an unintentional stick with a needle.
Okay.
And you would take that within, I believe it's 48 hours of exposure. And it's a regimen that you take to then eliminate the virus inside of the body.
Okay.
And so that was kind of like the information that we were pulling.
Okay. Okay. So I want to rewind just a little bit because you just said a lot of powerful things. And we're definitely leaning into the biology of this, which obviously has connection to the history, meaning and the archaeology, the language, and the overarching culture. Why, in your opinion, why do you think that human being, when they went to urgent care, and it sounds as though they were refused services, why do you think those healthcare providers refuse to look at that human being as a human being?
I think the biggest conversation for rural Oklahoma is honestly lack of education and knowledge. In a rural setting, if you're a provider and you've never treated a transhuman and they come into your clinic, there's probably a little bit of fear as a provider of treating that individual and having a knowledge of how to go about that.
Okay.
When in that case, they should have just treated them like anybody else that had a cold.
Right.
Now, there may be, in some instances, some deep-seated biases towards transhuman beings based off of their experience. Their communication to us was it was a lack of knowledge of these things. The same when we're talking about PrEP and PEP, there's just a lack of knowledge of how these medications work. And as an individual who takes PrEP daily, it's so interesting to me when I work with various providers for my own care that they don't even know what that is. And I have to take the time to educate a medical provider on what a medication that I take daily is.
Okay, and so I'm going to ask a question that may be uncomfortable, and you have every right to. You are not transgender.
No.
So just because of you identifying in the LGBTQ plus community, I'm pausing, and I'm being intentional with this pause because we were just talking about a transgender human who had a cold, flu, whatever you want to identify it as, and then here is yet another human being that is not transgender yet has to educate. You see where I'm going with this?
Absolutely.
There just seems the common thread is not, and this is a rhetorical question, it's not however, some people believe being in the LGBTQ plus community is a lifestyle, however you want to label it. It is a reality. This is a human being. And I'm purposely pausing to help our listeners, because I know you and I get it, to help our listeners understand this is a human being. This is someone's child. This is someone's uncle, aunt, father. I mean, the list goes on. This is a human being. And the consistent underlying factor is education or the lack thereof. Yeah.
Yeah, because there's, even on the way here this morning, there were so many different areas that, like, in my head, I was like, this is one area that we're going to talk about today as well. And I think a lot of it stems from that word education. One rabbit hole that was in my head this morning was, and this is kind of sidesteps, but it's all kind of together at the same time, is in rural Oklahoma, there is no comprehensive sex education being presented in a public education forum. And what we are seeing as a result of that is young humans being exposed to and diagnosed with HIV who have no idea what the virus is, how they contracted the virus. And all they've been taught is the fear propaganda around it when they don't even realize that in today's modern medicine, HIV is easier for medical providers to manage than diabetes. There are so many maintenance medications that help individuals who are living with HIV in today's world that it is a manageable condition today. And the phrase that kept coming up into my mind was, there's these individuals who continuously advocate for individuals carrying to term, but then when those babies come into the world, we don't want to provide them with the tools to keep them alive and safe. And that's when it kind of stems back to you have to teach them about their bodies and how they work. And if they do certain things, what the consequences are and how they can work towards preventing some of those things. And having those very comprehensive conversations with children is so important. And it stems all the way back to if we just have these conversations and teach each other about these things, we don't have that individual trying to walk into a clinic to get their cold treated and the doctor saying, I don't treat trans people.
Right.
And it's like, don't treat my gender, treat my cold.
Right. Because I'm a human being.
Yeah.
So as you were talking about HIV, AIDS, I will be 57 this year. I remember in the 80s when HIV became a thing. I remember when Magic Johnson was diagnosed with HIV. I remember when Clark Hudson. Am I saying this? Okay? It's been. I remember Rock. There we go. Rock Hudson. I remember that, and I remember the fear that surrounded it, and that was, obviously last century, but not so long ago, and so to me, not just as a human being, but as a practicing anthropologist, I see the connection between it and COVID, the height of COVID, meaning in this context, when both first came out, for lack of better words, there was a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety. People were literally dying, like right in front of us. And we did not know how, why. We just knew what we saw. We knew what we were experiencing. Fast forward, COVID, we now know that it's an airborne disease. Fast forward, we now know that HIV/AIDS is a sexually blood transferable disease. But not everybody, for whatever reason, not everyone is willing to have those conversations. And so not only is there an underlying factor of education, it's putting the fear to the side to be educated, regardless of how you feel about this human being. This is a human being. So in your work of working with human beings that identify in this particular community, what has been their responses when they are not treated like a human being?
Trying to, initially very resilient, and they're trying to advocate for the next generation. So the next generation doesn't have to experience that. Just like the individual we talked to in Ardmore, they went straight to the provider, went to a provider with me, and we worked with them to where now there's a satellite clinic of Diversity Family Health that's been operating since 2018 or 19 in Ardmore, Oklahoma, to provide care now to the community. While I wish that we could create a satellite of Diversity Family Health in every quadrant of the world, it's not practical. And so what Diversity did was they created End HIV Oklahoma, which is a nonprofit working to, and the first goal is to seek funding to now create seminars throughout the state to start teaching medical providers about these various areas, trans care, HIV, preventative medications and maintenance medications. What are the steps that you take when you have a patient who comes in that has been exposed to HIV or is diagnosed with a positive test result? What are next steps for them? And essentially all that to say, to answer your question, is it's created a lot of resilience where people are working towards and developing networks and communities and starting to insulate with community to get resources and knowledge out there.
And so it sounds as though there's a conscientious focus to lean in on what we can do versus what we haven't done or are not doing.
Yeah.
And so I applaud that strategy. Don't get me wrong, not with this topic, but so many others. There are so many opportunities to criticize what has not worked. And there are equal, if not more, opportunities to identify strategies of what does work and really lean into that. So kudos. Where do you see the educating within the context of health and biology and language of humans that identify as LGBTQ+? Where do you see this going in Oklahoma, the country, and the world?
The reason I joined the board for End HIV Oklahoma this year, in fact, is because their goal as an institution is to eradicate exposures to HIV by 2030 through comprehensive education. And then the goal is to kind of echo that program throughout the U.S. And then kind of start bringing that kind of globally would be the goal. But that would be, for me, one major goal is by 2030, eradicating the exposures to HIV and having comprehensive education for providers throughout the state for trans care, for all care within the community, because each human being has a unique set of needs within their own parameters of what has been dubbed the alphabet mafia or the queer community. We all have our own unique experiences and medical needs that, for one, we have to absolutely be advocates for our own health care, but then we become advocates for each other, and we start to work together to continue to create these systems. But I think comprehensive education, and I kind of go back to this it seems so crazy to me that I was born in 86, I grew up in a time where sex education was part of the curriculum, and we had that program very early on. While back then
In Oklahoma.
I grew up in southern Arizona.
Okay.
But the program was in Oklahoma. It was in areas like Oklahoma, Missouri, Arkansas. It wasn't until the mid to late 90s where there was this huge push towards abstinence-only education. And then we started moving away to the point where now in rural Oklahoma, there's no comprehensive sex education in the public school system currently. And when we met with healthcare providers in Carter County and institution leaders for the health department at the time, that was their biggest concern, was the reason we have such high exposures to different STIs is because there's no comprehensive sex education. So then I go back to that phrase of, we advocate for individuals to carry to term, but then when the life is created, that's kind of where the protections stop.
Right.
Because sex education is going to help that child to grow up to be healthier in a safer environment.
Right. Yeah, that's another component of thick descriptions, is helping not only ourselves, but our listeners, the state, the country, the world, to understand the importance of sustainability. It's collectively, human beings, we can start just about anything. But when it comes to consistency and maintaining, that's not one of our strengths. I, as a practicing anthropologist, tie that to critical thinking, our lack of. We collectively tend to see something. We treat things like a light switch. Oh, I can just flip it and it's done. No, it's not. So, using that example, flipping the light switch from on to, like right now, we are sitting here with lights on. You, me, or Lawrence, our engineer, flip the light off, it becomes dark. Then the impact of, oh my gosh, it's dark. How do we move around because we can't see? And I'm purposely offering some tongue in cheek and being very serious of, we have to think beyond what the task or the action that we do, that there are consequences, good, bad, or indifferent. But it's like a domino. I do something, it's going to impact you. It's going to impact Lawrence. I mean, yeah. So this belief of silos, not sure where that came from, would really like for it to go away because it's not sustainable.
Yeah. And as far as the light switch on and off, I'm just as guilty. In 2020, the political world was very overwhelming, and I really felt like it was a good time for me to step away. I felt like we were moving in the right direction. We had expanded healthcare in Oklahoma. We had access to medication and healthcare, and everything seemed like it was moving in the right direction. And so I said, okay, now's a really good time for me to step back. And essentially I retired from the political arena. And then this last year, it's just been like, well, now it's time to get back. Get the boots back on and get back on the ground. That's why I joined the board for End HIV Oklahoma. That's why I reached out to you and said, let's have coffee and start the conversation. Because now there is a fear on the national level of what happens to our healthcare system. And a huge part of that was during the last administration, it was mandated that insurance companies cover PrEP.
Okay.
And, previously it wasn't always covered on every plan. The deductibles, one of the deductibles when I first went to get one of my prescriptions filled, it was $1,000.
Okay.
And fortunately, with programs like Ryan White,
okay.
And through that in Oklahoma specifically, it was called the 340B program. They cover the deductible, but those programs are going away. That funding is going away. And so now there's a fear within the community of like, what happens to our access to care? Because even for our siblings in the trans community, insurance covered certain medications and procedures. It's like, are we going to start rolling some of those back? And so now it's like, okay, we've got to get back out there and get back and start putting the work in.
And I hear you and I appreciate the transparency about that. I know for me personally and professionally, sometimes I just have to take a pause. Doing this work, meaning educating, can be very draining. Because it's not so much of wanting people to come on one side or the other. It's be able to understand a side that is not yours. And I've seen it happen personally, when there is a mutual understanding, regardless if we agree, we're able to move forward, collaborate and move forward on figuring out ways to resolve. When there is a focus of my way or your way, here we are. And so doing this work, like I said, it can be very draining. So understand why you took a pause. Hope you have accepted that you needed a break and glad you're back. And listening to you talk about advocating, it is not just for our listeners who don't know, it's not just for the LGBTQ plus. It's for any community that has historically been overlooked and the expectation from many, not all, many medical professionals is there is a standard and you need to acclimate to that standard, regardless if it applies to you or not. So it's one thing when you're speaking about a cold or a flu. Completely get that. However, if that trans human had something that they needed to talk to their doctor about that had to do with their transitioning, that is unique, that is specific, that needs a conversation. And unfortunately, there are many people for a variety of reasons that are not comfortable. And I get it that you're not comfortable, then let's figure out someone or a space where there is comfort, because this is a biological need that is happening. It needs to be addressed. There was something else you said. Oh, dang it. I hate it when I have brain farts. You said you were talking about LGBTQ plus. You were talking about health needs. Oh, well, it'll come to me. So you are doing, in addition to serving on boards and being back on boots on the ground, you also do something else that I think is very powerful. You want to share that as well?
Yeah. So a huge part of stepping away from the political arena was a journey of self-discovery and some healing for me. I went through a pretty traumatic event around 2001 that really forced me to step back for a while. And I spent the last 5 years healing from that, rediscovering who I was as an individual. And then part of that is now I want to help other people on their journey towards healing. And I started Quitch Apothecary, which is kind of a holistic umbrella, but like one of our biggest products is I make and sell tea. I became a master tea blender, and then we have other services and products as well as part of our umbrella. That really just helps people to holistically heal. I started the journey of utilizing tarot as a spiritual tool to help guide me, and utilize it with a lot of my clients to help guide them on their spiritual journey, which it's been a really interesting kind of transition for me, because I went from working at the Capitol and I had these senators and legislators and all these things as part of my centers of influences, and then I turned around and started saying, okay, well, this is what I'm going to start doing now, and some of them kind of stepped back and some of them stepped a little closer and said, well, tell me more. And so now it's going to be a really interesting next couple of years to see how do I continue doing that work, which has become my passion. I love it. It really ignites the fire inside of me, while still being that political advocate or just advocate in general for human rights and individuals' access to healthcare.
And so you are yet another example of a human being thick in description. I am confident some, if not many of our listeners, viewers, when you identify as part of the LGBTQ community, that they have put you in this box. And understood from an executive order perspective, there's a lot of conversation right now as it relates to this community. And you make tea. And y'all, I have the tea. In fact, I had a cup last night and this morning. So, bought some tea. And I shared this with Kyle the last time we talked. I bought some tea. It's been a couple of years. I bought, do you still put them in the book?
No, that was just special packaging for you.
Oh, okay. I feel so special. So purchased some tea from Kyle. And if you don't know, in my former life, I was a librarian and director of a library. And so he cultivated some. I told him, just make tea. And he's like, what kind do you want? I was like, just make it, and I'm open to trying something new. And so in these beautiful containers, he cultivated some wonderful tea and then put them in a book and not a real book, but the packaging is a book. And I still have that. There's a few people that look at it. In fact, it's a conversation piece, and a few people will look at it and it's like, well, that's a really cool book. And then open it and there's nothing in there now because I took all the tea out. But yeah, it's a wonderful conversation piece. And you do readings.
Mm-hmm.
And you said that was a passion of yours. So from like childhood?
So my grandma in Southern Arizona has always read tarot, and then 2005, even further back, I was stationed in Sierra Vista, Arizona, at Fort Huachuca, and I stepped off base and I found a little metaphysical shop and I bought a tarot deck, and I've always kind of used it as a private tool to help guide me. And then when I stepped away from the political arena, I started doing it for friends, and finally, one of my spiritual consultants told me, she says, if you want people to take you seriously, she was like, there has to be an exchange. She's like, you can't continuously just give your gifts away because they'll always treat you kind of as a sideshow, some entertainment.
That is correct.
And so then when I started doing it professionally and getting compensated for it, people started taking the work very seriously. And my goal, and the term that I use through kind of my journey and working with some of my spiritual counselors and guidance, I currently identify as a shamanic practitioner. And the tarot is just one of the many tools that I employ to help individuals heal on their journey. But she said, you've got to be compensated for this professionally. And it's interesting because I have my favorite story so far, or I guess one of the accomplishments as a healer that I've helped with, was an individual that I started working with about 4 years ago, that she came to me and was kind of in a situation where she was struggling with a relationship and kind of going back and forth with it, and put her career on pause for this relationship. And through kind of some of the guidance through the cards, it was like, well, no, really need to focus on career. And that literally became stairs overnight for her. She cut ties with her ex and started moving into her career. And now she went from just being a part of the sales driving force at this company to a regional manager, and had to move overseas to New Zealand and Australia, where she oversees their operations in those two regions. And then, we still continuously work virtually. And now it's like, okay, now that you've blossomed and you've grown and you found your passion, now let's redirect and start looking at relationships again. Now that you've discovered you. And that's just a small part of what I do now. And I love working with humans. Actually, next fall, the timeline currently is that there's a documentary around one of my clients and his healing journey, and him and his wife both tie all of his healing work back to the foundation of what we started together. On his healing journey. And all that kind of stems back to my passion of helping individuals access healthcare. Because one of the things I say to every client, if you're coming to me and you're struggling with mental health, you have to have a mental health provider involved. If you're coming to me and you're struggling with physical health, there has to be a medical provider involved, because I can't be those two things. I'm not those
You're
two
clear
things.
what your lane is,
I'm the spiritual advisor, and they are the health advisors. Now, there are things spiritually we can talk about that help, but they are not supplements or replacement for medications.
They work together. There's a
tandem.
collaboration. Right. So how is this working for you here in Oklahoma, the Bible Belt?
It stems back to a word that's been in my head all morning as we've been talking, is disinformation or misinformation. And even around access to healthcare for queer humans, there's this, even going back into the AIDS epidemic, there was so much misinformation around it on how you could be exposed. And
I remember that.
And, even the biggest thing that stands out for me for trans humans is there's this huge weapon that politicians are using, and they're saying, they're wanting sex change operations for children.
I heard that.
And I think that...
I heard that.
I don't know where that started, but I personally know that the medical provider that I worked with to help establish the clinic in Ardmore is a very firm advocate for, if a 12-year-old child comes to their parent and says, I don't feel like this is my gender. As a medical provider, what they do is they start beta blockers,
Okay.
which prevents them from experiencing puberty until they are developed enough to make that decision for themselves legally as an adult. And so there are options for them in that direction, but that's what he works towards. And that kind of goes back to the misinformation around the situation. And it also goes back to that, like, they advocate so firmly to carry that child to term, but then when the life is created, that's when the care stops. We don't care about their mental health state. We don't care about working with them and advocating for them. We don't care about educating them. And all that kind of goes back to where I was getting is, as an individual who now reads tarot, as an example, in Oklahoma, the biggest pushback I get is a fear of how it aligns with the major religion here, which is Christianity. And it's viewed as a tool of the devil or evil or whatever term they prefer to use, when it's really interesting because tarot actually came from the majority of what we know of tarot today came from Catholicism. The Hierophant in the tarot journey is depicted in the Visconti, which is one of the original. It is the original tarot deck that we had designed in the 1400s. Was the Pope, and it's just so interesting that people don't know the history. And another example of a client, I had a young human come to me. And under 18, so mom sat in on the tarot reading and did a reading for him, gave spiritual advice, was absolutely in love with it. So in love that he said, I want to buy the same tarot deck that you use.
Okay.
So he got the tarot deck, started practicing for himself. Unfortunately, months after we came to know one another, he left this earth. And his mother came back to me with his sister. And she said, I want her to see what you do.
Okay.
And so I said, yeah, come in and sit down. And I read for mother and showed her what tarot was. And her experienced daughter was that tarot was this evil thing. And based on her Christian belief, she believed that it was sin, essentially, to experience and touch the tarot. Mom wanted daughter to have son's tarot deck.
Got it.
And so when I did the reading, daughter said, oh, no, I want one.
Oh, wow.
Please do that for me.
Okay.
She saw that it wasn't anything other than spiritual advice and guidance. The one thing I say every time somebody sits across from me for the first time is, I'm not a fortune teller. I can't tell you what the future is because I promise you, Suzette, if I could, you and I would be playing the lottery and all of these nonprofits that we are so heavily invested in would be fully funded tomorrow.
Yes. However,
we use the tarot as a tool to help guide us towards the outcome that we desire. And what do we want? And what does success for us look like? And how do we get there? And when she saw that, she says, I want to experience that. She still wasn't comfortable with taking her brother's tarot deck, but she was comfortable enough to sit down and say, I want to experience this. And a lot of times that's what happens. People are afraid. I always hear, I'm so afraid. And it's like, well, it's because you're so programmed and used to the Hollywoodized or the Christian fear of what tarot is that you've never really truly seen what it is or experienced it firsthand. And it's such a profound experience that really helps guide people. And like I said, it's just become absolutely my passion. I love doing it.
That's cool. That is really cool. And this is happening in Oklahoma, y'all. Just make sure y'all hear that. So when you think of Oklahoma and the cowboys and Indians, the stereotype, there are also tarot readers and a growing and thriving LGBTQ plus communities. And I could keep going. You hit on a few things that I wanted to circle back on, like this belief that if a young human, someone 17 and under, doesn't identify as a certain gender, that the belief is that this is not a conversation that should involve their parents, where legally they are their parents' responsibility. Two, that is the pushback from lawmakers, politicians, that if that young mind wants to make that transition, be a transhuman, that it should not be paid for by state or federal funding, or that it shouldn't happen at all, or both?
Both.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That, so, yeah, that gets really sticky, in my opinion, personally and professionally, especially the component of if a parent or parents have the financial resources and they are supporting their young human in this transition, why should lawmakers have any say-so about that? With the understanding that that young human and their adults, their guardians, are really clear about the consequences of these choices. So it's not a, like I used earlier, it's not a light switch. It's several months, years, however long, of education of this is what my body looks like now, this is what it could look like later on, and these are the ramifications that come with it. Again, good, bad, or indifferent. And it appears, and this is definitely a question, that if those procedures happen with state or federal funding, shouldn't that be the choice of those that are paying taxes?
Yeah. And I think that for me comes from our job of having the conversations. It also comes from just like this lack of empathy that, and part of it is we live in such an isolated world, even though we're more connected now than ever.
Very much so.
That we, and especially in Oklahoma, we live in these bubbles.
Yes, we do.
And we don't experience other cultures or experiences, and all we know is our experience. And until we start challenging that experience and introducing them to other cultures and other experiences and other perspectives, that mindset's not going to change. And it's going to take continuous work and deprogramming. And a huge part of what, in my own family, there was generationally this belief that I work this hard, you have to work this hard. This is the life that I live. This is the life you have to live. And it's like, no, like live the life and experience that you want to, that fuels your passion and makes you happy, because we only get one chance.
Agreed.
And
unless you're into reincarnation, but that's another conversation.
Until we acknowledge that each individual should be allowed to have the experience that they want, as long as they're not harming another human being or themselves, let them live their life and be who they are. And there's this book, Good versus Evil, Why Good People Do Bad Things. And it's actually really politically rooted in where does good and evil come from for us as a society. And here's one example that the author uses. He's presenting to his class, and he says there's a 70-year-old woman who's widowed. Friday night, she decides to cook and eat fish.
Okay.
Do you think that is wrong?
No.
So in some Asian cultures, fish is viewed as an aphrodisiac, especially when heated.
Okay.
And by consuming the raw fish and encouraging her sexuality, she is offending the spirit of her deceased husband.
Okay.
It gets even more graphic, and if you need to edit this out later, you're welcome to. But another example that he presents to his classroom is there's an individual who has the desire to sexualize children.
Oh, wow.
And wants to engage in sex with children. In order to curb his appetite, as the author verbalizes or writes, the individual then goes to the grocery store and purchases a chicken carcass, once a
Okay.
month
Okay.
and proceeds to have sex with the carcass.
Wow.
Cooks and then eats the carcass.
Okay.
And then asks the classroom, do you think that is wrong? And then we get into like, there's just like this huge conversation of like all these different viewpoints of how that's working and going on. And really it's such a great read that really challenges like, where does good versus evil come from? Like, where's the line? Who drew it? And I think for me personally, as long as I'm not hurting somebody else or taking away from their ability to live their life to their fullest, that I should be able to do whatever I want with my body and who I am.
Understood.
And you even notated tattoos and in your own upbringing that it was believed that as, I'll let you
Modest, yeah. As a modest female, I was raised that modest women don't get tattoos. And so I have struggled I do not have any tattoos. Plan on getting one before I close my eyes for the last time. But as I was telling Kyle before we started this podcast, the $1 million question is where and what? But yeah, you hit on some more very powerful things, powerful topics. So have had the privilege to travel to Kenya and visited a tribe. This was a few years back, and where circumcision here in the United States is a staple for boys at birth. For this tribe, circumcision happens when the young male turns 13. It's a rite of passage. And in other tribes, not only is circumcision happening as a teenager, having sex with another man is part of their experience of them becoming a man. And when I got exposed to that information, I really had to step back because that pushed against what I was raised to believe was good versus evil. And so I hear you as it relates to that. And a huge part of who we are collectively as Oklahomans is we've always done things a certain way. And it's either our way or no way. And regardless if you listeners can receive the stories that Kyle has shared and even the ones that I have, understand that there is states, nations, world out there that does things differently and have a history, a language, the biology, and cultural references to support why they do what they do. Regardless if you agree or disagree, it's the willingness to understand someone else's experiences and do your best to respect it. We don't have to agree. Like case in point, like Kyle brought up about the tattoos. No one is holding a gun to my head to get a tattoo. Yet pretty much everywhere I look, not just in Oklahoma City, the state, the country, and the world, people are tattooed up, down, around. And so no pressure for me because I am making piece of, and this is just one of many examples, I acknowledge and respect how I was raised. It's not necessarily the way that I want to move forward within the context of tattoos. However, being in spaces with people that understand my experiences, choose to respect it. Again, they can be tattooed from head to toe, but understand that that's not my journey, and that's okay, because me having a tattoo or not is not going to impact them, and vice versa. Someone having sex with a chicken is not going to impact me one way or another. It is. I am now very curious. Now, what's the name of that book?
Good versus evil: Why Good People Do Bad Things.
Interesting.
And even to speak on that and kind of circle back to the conversation we started with, if male conservative politicians don't like gay marriage, my favorite phrase is, then don't marry a man.
Yeah. Because you do have that choice.
Yeah.
this, what I'm not necessarily introducing, but I think a foundational component of this, and was just having this conversation with someone else right before you and I met, is values. If you have 5 values and I have 5 values, instead of us focusing on the 2 or 3 values that don't mirror, if we could focus on the 2 or 3 that do mirror, that is a wonderful start. What I have noticed personally and professionally over the last 10 plus years, give or take, is most people don't know what their values are. And it's almost like they are rudderless. They're just kind of moving around the world, not being grounded in who they are. A tattoo is not who you are. You being part of the LGBT, that's not who you are. It's a component of it. Your tattoo is a component of it. Me being African American, that's not who I am. It's a component of it. We're both human beings. We both have, like, you and I share a value of live and let live for the most part. As long as it's not impeding my ability to be who I am and vice versa, you go right ahead. And there's a lot of fear-based legislation, a lot of fear-based language, a lot of fear-based stuff. And again, personally and professionally, I have learned that when people tell me who they are, I believe them. And I've had people, even a person that served on the Thick Descriptions board says, I'm fearful of this. Then you're probably not a good fit, because I'm fine with people having fear. I have a problem with people making decisions out of fear. I'm fine with people being anxious. I'm fine with people being angry. Any emotion that any human being has. But when we make decisions, we make laws out of those emotions that are going to stick with us at least 4 years, give or take.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
No. So before we wrap up, anything else you want to share?
Oh, that's a loaded question.
It is. I did it purposely.
That could be 3 or 4 more episodes for us.
I know.
I think it just kind of, to sum it all up, or not to sum it all up, I think that continuing to advocate for, and if you haven't visited the Thick Descriptions website and you want conversations like these to continue, contributions are extremely important. It is time now in 2025 for us to start opening up our checkbooks and start donating to these causes, supporting them. If you can't financially contribute to an organization like Thick Descriptions, share this podcast with friends, share the video with friends, get the information out there, because maybe there is one of those friends that's willing to give a couple of dollars, and maybe you have 10,000 friends who are willing to give a couple of dollars to Thick Descriptions. But these institutions now more than ever need funding, because the nonprofit world is really stepping into a space where you are doing the work that the government is failing to do.
Right.
And you're having the conversations with people that are keeping people alive.
Right.
Because out there somewhere, I know that there's somebody that's listening that's struggling as a queer human in rural Oklahoma that may listen to this and say, maybe there is hope for me. There are people out there working and advocating for me.
Right.
So absolutely share it. Send contributions in if you can to Thick Descriptions. And I'm speaking as a former board member who passionately supports your mission as an institution. And I've seen firsthand the work that Thick Descriptions does. When we went into rural Oklahoma, and we didn't even talk about the film that we screened, but we screamed Race, the Power of an Illusion.
That's right.
And we talked about redlining in districts and
Yes, we did.
how systemic racism exists today in public policy. And the amount of people that say, I didn't know that.
Exactly.
And the way that it opens people's eyes up and changes their perspective is profound. And that's why I've always passionately supported the work of Thick Descriptions. And if there's anything I can conclude with, it is that very paramount, like now is the time to support the institutions that work towards the change that you support and believe in. And so I think the biggest thing I can say again, reaffirming the words, share this podcast with your friends, share it with loved ones that maybe have a different perspective, who maybe are on the fence about queer issues and queer rights around healthcare, with that relative that doesn't understand the struggle that we experience in rural Oklahoma. And maybe share it with those friends who do support this information and cause, that maybe financially would be willing to support thick descriptions, so we can continue to have these conversations and continue to do the work that our government is currently failing to do.
Well said. Well said. So, thank you, Kyle. We could, like you said, we could do this for like
6 more episodes.
Yes, at least. Very grateful for our connection. You all definitely check out Kyle. Say the name of your business.
So it is Quitch Apothecary. And my residence for tarot is at Craig's Emporium here in Oklahoma City, where I read every Friday and Sunday. You can call the shop, look on our website at craigsemporium.com to book an appointment if you're interested, and then find Quitch Apothecary on Facebook and Instagram. And then Craig's also carries my full line of products.
Cool. Thank you, Kyle.
Thank you.
All right.